Hello everybody, welcome again to another lecture for COM 102, Intro to Public Speaking. Today I want to talk a little bit about the idea of finding research. You know, one of the things that is always sometimes difficult for students is how do you find the kind of materials you need to put together your different kinds of speeches. So for me there are three really big kind of bugaboos when it comes to public speaking. First is finding and narrowing your topic, right? How do you, what do you pick from? You know, and I always recommend you pick from something that you're interested in, something that's important to your life. You know, for example, if you have an illness or something like that, or if you know someone who suffers, you know, maybe you do an informative speech on that. I have had students who've done wonderful speeches on, you know, Alzheimer's or cancer, a type of cancer or whatever it might be. If you're fascinated by technology, you might do something in that area. If you're fascinated by different kinds of cars, if you're, you know, I had a student who did a great job describing the M series from BMW and so forth. It would have been really, really great if he would have actually used visual aids, but it was actually a pretty good speech otherwise. So narrowing your topic is one. The second one is finding all the materials, and that's what we're going to do today. How do you find those things? I'm actually going to show you on the screen where you can find those kinds of materials here at Bridgewater State, specifically two large databases that should be able to help you out with that, and then talk to you also about how you cite those sources in your speech. And then the final thing, and this is the one that everybody gets concerned about, is delivery, right? You know, whether I trip over my words, do I say enough ums or ahs or whatever. You probably noticed a few times that I will use or as I'm trying to do this on the fly. I'm doing what is called an extemporaneous form of delivery, and sometimes it can lead to disfluencies and so forth. But we'll talk a little bit about that. But one of the things I want to do, so we have some questions here, you know, talking about a preview for this particular lecture. What are the difference between primary and secondary sources? What role do they play in the process, speech-making process? What the process should allow a speaker to do when collecting information? Where can a speaker locate those secondary sources? I'll actually show you specifically where you can get that at BSU. What process should a speaker follow when charting information for primary to secondary? And why speakers should carefully scrutinize the credibility associated with all different sources. So before we begin, let me talk to you about how I want you, I think there are two different types of sources. Not primary and secondary, but when it comes to your speeches, what I deem regular sources and then on the web, okay? And so if you take a look at the guidelines that are located on Blackboard, you're going to find that I require that you must cite a minimum of 4 sources in your speech, okay? They must be orally cited in your speech in addition to the bibliography that you're going to hand in with your outline. Now, the question always becomes, well then how do I orally cite my speeches, or cite those sources? Well, I have you do them in 2 different ways. First, when it comes to a regular source would be things like books, magazines, you know, anything that you can find in print, pretty much. And so I just have you do the source and the date. So for example, according to the New York Times of July 31st, 2017, blah, 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 blah. You don't need to cite the author. You don't need to cite the name of the article. I think that's a lot of fluff and a lot of information. A lot of people put that in there because, one, they want to waste time. I don't need the author. I just need, you know, you can put the author and the book together if you want to, but it's something that you should focus on the source and the date. That's it. I think it's simple and it's clean. If you're going to do an internet source or a source that doesn't have some kind of print item to it, then I want the home page and the date that you last accessed. So for example, if you go to a news article on CNN, which obviously doesn't have a print version of CNN, it's not a print newspaper, and you find an article from CNN.com /backstory /Trump you know, heretofore 1256.htm, I don't expect you to cite that entire URL in your speech. That would be crazy. All I want you to do is, according to CNN.com, last accessed November 3rd, 2016, and then maybe you give us the information about that particular article. If you want to put in the title of the article, again, you can. There's nothing wrong with that, but I don't think it necessarily enhances your credibility unless it's some really, really important kind of researcher. So you might cite, if somebody's the head of a particular department of research, if you're doing something on marine biology and you cite the director of the lab at Woods Hole on the Cape, that would certainly be a significant source or so forth. But I just want you source and date. Now, how do I determine what is considered an internet source versus, say, a regular source? It's, as I mentioned, if something can be found in print, like the New York Times, a lot of the information you're going to find is probably going to come from the library's databases. However, we can find a print version of that. Is that, to me, a regular source? Absolutely. It's not an internet source, because even though you're finding it from an online database. Okay? If it is something that's totally digital, then that is considered to be an online source. Okay? And the maximum you can have is half the number of sources you cite. So considering you have to do a minimum of 4 sources, you have to have a minimum or a maximum of 2 that you can do that would be traditionally online for some kind of website. Or do not cite things like Wikipedia and other kinds of, or dictionary.com, that kind of stuff. Actually go and look up some things. Wikipedia can actually be really, really interesting, but Wikipedia often has different citations for its particular articles and so forth. So you should go actually look at the citations and actually go to the original source instead of citing Wikipedia. Okay? So when it comes to looking at primary resources are things that are actually things that we can, touch, feel, and so forth. So they would be things like personal interviews. They would be actual historical documents that you can go and find. Like if you go into the National Archives and you can see the original copy of the Constitution. Or if you go in, if you're a geek like me who goes in and does research on speeches, I want to go into the archives of some kind of museum, and I want to look at the actual writings of a particular politician or other figure and so forth. Those would be a primary source because I'm not relying on a secondary interpretation of something. Certainly a survey could be considered a primary source if you've done your own survey of individuals or something, and you're not citing another survey from somebody else. Personal experience can be used to certainly provide credibility, but personal experience is not a source, okay? Because how can you cite a source and date, and how can you provide that? How can you cite that? It's a primary source. It can help enhance credibility, but it doesn't necessarily provide you specifically the idea of actual source citations for this particular speech. You can interview people. In fact, I would encourage you to think about it. If you know somebody that's directly involved, if you know like a doctor or an expert, feel free to do what's called a personal interview. And you'd cite that simply by saying, in a personal interview conducted with Dr. Edwards and if you're interviewing me about presidential rhetoric, which is I'm an expert on, or at least considered to be an expert, well then yeah, I would be a primary source. But if you're going to ask, well, according to my brother David, if you're going to talk about cancer, my brother David, who knew somebody who had cancer, whose brother was in the hospital, that would not be an expert, and I wouldn't expect you to do a personal interview with that particular person. So again, I'm open to all kinds of different topics. If you want to do it on a new video game, if you want to do whatever. But again, I would encourage you to stay away from things that, again, are illegal or potentially going to get you in trouble and me in trouble. I would encourage you to stay away from biography speeches, because how can you sum up someone's life, especially like Martin Luther King Jr. or even like Tom Brady in 4 to 6 minutes? It's just really, really difficult. So focus on a topic that can be narrowed down and that can really capture your audience's attention. Okay? So when you're talking about interviewing, doing a primary interview, this is a really, really quick version. There's actually a larger technique, and I'll be more than happy to help anybody with it. But you want to establish the interview's credibility prior to the interview. So in other words, how is this person credible? Again, if this person has been, if you're doing a speech on how to make, baseball hats or hats or whatever, and you have a friend who's been working for 30 years in that industry, well, yeah, they would be really, really credible because obviously they have a lot of industry experience. So you'd say something to the effect of, according to Howard Dean, who's had 30 years of experience working for Reebok, especially in the hat division, blah, 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 that would be a way to establish. You want to use open-ended and probing questions to collect information. You don't want to use yes or no questions. That doesn't give you your interviewee a chance to respond and expand. And of course, you want to ask for permission to use that information. It's actually considered to be quite unethical to not ask that person for permission in the first place. Certainly, effective research, and most of you are going to do secondary sources, right? They will be published statistics, texts, articles written by personal documents, that kind of stuff. And so here's where I want to show you from the library's homepage where you can find actually a couple of these different kinds of sources. So for example, I'm appearing out of the screen, okay? And if you'll take a look, if you go to the Bridgewater State's library's homepage, which is library.bridgew.edu, you'll notice the homepage, okay? And if you can't, hopefully you can zoom in a little bit, but you can see there's a link called Databases A to Z, all right? So you want to click on those databases, and when you do this, you're eventually, when you come to this information, once you click on the database, you're eventually going to have to put your username and password. That shouldn't be a problem for any of you, but something just to think about, okay? The two databases that I would use would be Academic Search Premier, which is pretty easy to use. You would just put any kind of search term in there you would want, or LexisNexis. LexisNexis is a warehouse primarily of newspapers and business periodicals. It's got every single major newspaper going back decades that you could look up. And it's a fantastic resource that not enough students use. So Academic Search Premier, okay, which is an EBSCO database and so forth. You can put in any kind of thing you want. You can narrow it down in a variety of ways. And try to make sure you try to narrow it down and so forth as you're going through, or LexisNexis. Those would be the two items that I would want you to look, the two databases I would want you to use the most when you're looking up these different kinds of secondary sources. Now here's the key to looking up those sources. When you're looking up those databases, you want to use, because for example, let's just say you go into the Academic Search Premier and you type in football. Damn, you're probably going to get 10,000, 20,000 articles, okay? So that's why it's important for you to, when you're doing your topic, to narrow your topic down a lot more. So if you type in football and you use something called a Boolean phrase, right? You can also use, by the way, Google Scholar, JSTOR, and so forth. But again, Google could pull up a whole bunch of stuff that could be uncredible. When you use a lot of databases in the library, you know that a lot of that stuff is going to be screened out. You're not going to just get some random blog post from, some Tom, Dick, and Harry from the internet. Whereas you're going to get that with Google. When you're doing these kinds of secondary searches, you want to use what is called a Boolean phrase. A Boolean phrase is where you combine words together by using the words and or. Okay? So if I want to look at football and New England Patriots, well, obviously that's going to narrow your search even further. You're probably going to have a huge, amount of articles, but you still actually narrow it quite a bit. So maybe you want to do football and New England Patriots and Tom Brady, something like that. Or football and New England Patriots and Deflategate, or something like that. See, again, we narrow it down even further. You might start with even the idea of Deflategate, but you never know how those keywords are being cited in the article themselves. Okay? Okay, so secondary sources can be found again via email, news groups, websites, and so forth. All of these are certainly valid. Okay? The problem is that when you're looking at the credibility of those sources, a big thing that's in the news right now is the idea of fake news. We know on websites that people are actively creating fake news articles to, really to drive traffic to their websites so they can make money. But a lot of those articles are just false. They're patently false. So how can you avoid that? If you use databases like the EBSCO and the LexisNexis database, or tried and true sources, from credible newspapers and so forth, then you won't run into that problem. That's why I want you to avoid a lot of those kinds of, just citing something from a random blog or something. You have no idea the credibility of that particular person. Okay? When it comes to obviously doing research, be open-minded, take good notes. You can certainly read this and so forth. All of these, again, is true. Really the big one is how do you evaluate the quality of the research? Because a lot of you, this will be some of the very first research that you're doing. So let's talk about the idea of evaluating research. One, stick with sources that tend to be objective. Those are sources that usually tend to be in the media, sources that we know, things like the New York Times, Washington Post, things even like Fox News or NBC or whatever. At least they have the veneer of objectivity. I know that CNN, MSNBC, Fox News are much more, controversial and so forth, but at least they are news organizations that have journalistic standards that they attempt to meet. Okay, so those would be much more credible than, say, Joe's blog on, Boston politics or whatever it might be. Okay, certainly establish the credibility of each source. Okay, you can do that by a number of things if you cite again somebody's credentials. But if it's a source like the New York Times or even a news organizations or so forth, they pretty much have a pretty good credible reputation. If you do something like Wikipedia or something like that that doesn't have as good of a reputation, and the reason why Wikipedia is bad is because you can go in and alter those articles. Anybody can actually go in and alter them. That's why they're not credible. You can't necessarily do that with regular kind of news sources. Scholarly articles. I have what is called a peer review process. I would love you to find more scholarly articles, especially if you're dealing with some kind of topic that's scientific or complex in nature. You can find that through Academic Search Premier. And then, of course, you want to be wary of websites and blogs that are protected or or safeguarded because, again, they can be somewhat problematic. Okay. If you have more specific questions about how to find resources or really about narrowing your topic or anything, please send me some questions immediately and I will do my best to help you as much as possible. So we're going to talk, that's the idea of finding research. We're going to talk next about how you use that research and specific kinds of examples or specific different items that you can actually cite in your speeches. Things like examples, quotations, and different kind of definitions and so forth as we move forward. Thank you, and we'll talk to you soon.